Most men assume that if they're told a child is theirs, it's true. We grow up believing fatherhood begins with trust, not verification. But the truth is that fatherhood, legally and emotionally, is one of the most high-stakes responsibilities a man will ever take on. And most men enter it with no clarity, no protection, no understanding of what that commitment legally means. Coming up, I'll expose that society is redefining modern fatherhood, telling us that there are three different versions of fatherhood: biological fatherhood, legal responsibility, and emotional parenting. And these do not always line up. You can be financially responsible and emotionally attached without being the biological father. You can be emotionally bonded without legal rights. And depending on when you find out the biological truth, the law may not care. This means that timing is everything, and most men don't even find that out until it's way too late. Women have multiple ways to verify paternity on their terms, legally, medically, and even through consumer DNA databases without the man's consent. But many men are unaware that trying to quietly test paternity themselves can be illegal, inadmissible, or even used against them. In other words, the system gives one party clarity and the other party responsibility. And if men don't understand this, they walk into fatherhood absolutely blind. This video is about clarity, agency, and informed choice. It's about understanding when paternity test matters, what the law actually says, how misattributed paternity happens, and how to enter fatherhood with the intentions instead of assumptions. Because fatherhood is sacred, and sacred commitments should be made with your eyes wide open. So let's break it all down. There is a major gap in what most men understand about fatherhood, paternity testing, and the legal and cultural landscape around all of it. From childhood, men are encouraged to assume that if a woman says a child is theirs, they should simply accept that and step into the role of fatherhood without hesitation or confirmation. Masculinity is framed as decisive loyalty, emotional steadiness, and stepping up to responsibility. But there is very little guidance on when and how a man should verify that responsibility before taking it on, and even less discussion on how the law treats fatherhood differently depending on the timing and context of that verification. The result is that many men enter fatherhood with good intentions but without clarity. And that lack of clarity can be life-altering. To understand what's at stake, the first thing a man needs to understand is that according to the law and growing narratives, fatherhood is not one singular thing. Apparently there are three different dimensions of fatherhood operating at the same time, and they do not always automatically align. The causal father is the biological progenitor, the man whose sperm created the child. The material father is the one legally and financially responsible for supporting the child, regardless of biology. And the moral father is the man who actually performs fatherhood, the one who loves, nurtures, protects, guides, and emotionally invests in the child. The moral father is what men generally mean or understand when they hear or say being a father. But the legal system primarily concerns itself with material fatherhood, specifically that financial obligation. And paternity testing only answers the question of causal fatherhood. That's the genealogy. These layers do not automatically overlap, and confusing them is at the root of most of the emotional and legal damage that comes with paternity disputes. A man can be the biological father but never act as a parent. Another man can be a bonded parent without any biological tie. And the law may still require a man to financially support a child, even if he is neither biologically related nor involved in raising the child, depending on how and when responsibility was assumed. And this leads to one of the most crucial and least understood realities. Timing is everything. A man is morally and logically justified in wanting to confirm whether a biological child is his before he commits to raising that child. Fatherhood is one of the most permanent commitments a person can make, emotionally and financially. The decision to enter that role should be informed. But once a man has already formed a bond with the child, Once he has acted as a moral father by nurturing, protecting, caring, and developing attachment, then discovering later that he is not the biological father does not erase that relationship in the eyes of the law or in much of society's ethical sense of responsibility. They claim that the reasoning is simple. Children are innocent. They did not deceive anyone. If a man steps into the role of father and becomes the emotional center of a child's life, the child begins to rely on him, attach to him, and shape their identity around that connection. And to walk away or to withdraw support at that point is not seen as correcting a deception, but as harming a child who did nothing wrong. Courts, psychological frameworks, and ethical arguments tend to agree with that point, which is why in most jurisdictions, finding out after the fact that one is not the biological father does not remove the obligation of support, and it does not undo legal or parental responsibility if the man has already functioned as a father. And because of that, scholars who write on the subject often argue that if paternity testing is going to happen, it should happen early, preferably before the father-child bond is even formed. Some suggest that it should happen prenatally or at birth. But here the debate becomes politically charged. The strongest opposition to universal paternity testing is based on the argument that mandatory testing at birth violates the mother's right to privacy. The reasoning is that confirming paternity does more than determine biological relationships. It has the potential to expose details about the mother's sexual history, infidelity, or relationships outside of the cultural expectation of monogamy. The act of testing then becomes not just a medical question, but a moral inquiry into her behavior. And this is often framed by critics as state intrusion into reproductive autonomy, as well as an implicit accusation of dishonesty directed at all mothers. So the resistance is not just emotional, but legal and philosophical. It changes the balance of reproductive autonomy between men and women. In effect, the culture has normalized that men must trust, while women retain control over the narrative of reproduction. And this was where misattributed paternity statistics really matter, but they are often misrepresented. The commonly cited figure of 10 to 30% children being raised by fathers who are not their biological fathers usually comes from samples in which men already suspected infidelity and voluntarily sought testing. So the numbers are skewed upward by self-selection. But large general population genetic studies tend to find lower rates, somewhere between 1 and 4% of children being unknowingly raised by men who are not their biological fathers. And that's anywhere between 1 in 100 children and 1 in 25 children. And that may sound small, but it is not negligible. Even at 1%, that is 1 in every 100 fathers, millions of them globally. And the emotional, financial, and relational consequences in those cases are tremendous. If you drove a car with a 1 to 4% chance of catastrophic brake failure, you would not ignore that risk. But men are expected to ignore the risk when it comes to the most permanent decision of their lives. Many men assume that if they ever want to verify paternity discreetly, they can simply collect DNA from a straw, toothbrush, maybe a little bit of hair, or a discarded item and send it to a private lab. And this is where many get blindsided. In the UK and in several United States, collecting or submitting DNA without the person's consent is illegal, sometimes even criminally. And even when not illegal, covert samples are often inadmissible in court. And if the situation later becomes contested, the attempt itself can legally undermine a man's position. So the quiet test approach is not only unreliable, it can backfire very, very badly. Meanwhile, the mother does not face those same barriers. A mother with legal custody can consent on behalf of the child to have the child's DNA tested, and then upload those results to consumer genealogy databases like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe. And from there, she does not need the alleged father's DNA at all. She can use genetic matching to identify paternal relatives. whether it's cousins, grandparents, or even distant matches, and then triangulate the identity of the biological father with remarkable accuracy. In other words, the mother has the ability to establish paternity without the man's cooperation, but the man does not have equal access to confirm paternity without hers. This imbalance reveals a cultural double standard in that men are expected to prove loyalty up front without confirmation or evidence, while women retain the authority to disclose or conceal genetic truth. And men are shamed for wanting clarity because it's framed as insecure, controlling, or untrusting, while women, on the other hand, are socially permitted to verify paternity without stigma when it benefits them. The result is that men are encouraged to feel that asking for confirmation is dishonorable, when in reality, the opposite is true. Trust is meaningful only when it is chosen, not when it's demanded under threat of shame. So what should a man do? The answer depends on values and timing, to be honest. If a man has not yet formed a father-child bond, and if biological certainty matters to him, then he should be clear about that very, very early. He should openly discuss paternity, and he should make decisions about commitment with clarity, not assumptions. If testing is needed, it's best done at birth, through proper legal channels where results are admissible and no rights are violated. Once a man has already formed a bond with the child, the situation changes, and quite honestly, it's way too late. At that point, the question becomes not about biology, but about the child's emotional life and stability. And according to the law, if he is the parenting figure, that is, if he is the person that the child reaches for, depends on, and identifies as the father, then his role is real, and walking away will not correct a lie. It will harm the innocent, according to the law. The deeper cultural issue here is that men are taught to treat fatherhood as something that just happens, something that arrives through circumstance rather than deliberate choice. But real fatherhood is not passive, it's intentional. And it's not something that a man should stumble into simply because someone tells him he should. A man has the right and the responsibility to know the truth before he dedicates his entire life to another human being. And if he chooses to become a father, truly become one, then his commitment must be built on clarity, not assumption, not pressure, and not blind trust. So I hope that the core messages are simple. Know what fatherhood means, know when clarity matters, and know what the law will and will not protect. And enter fatherhood with your eyes wide open. Because once you step into that role, once a child knows you as their father, your identity and theirs become linked in a way that biology alone cannot define. And that bond is sacred, and sacred things deserve to be chosen, not assumed, coerced, or stumbled into without understanding the stakes.